Hi everybody, nice to see you. Welcome to session number 5 of our lecture. We have a lot to do today, so let's get started, as always, with a little recap of the last session. In the last session, I inserted this block on bias and discrimination in the middle of the bigger block on power because bias and discrimination are maybe prime examples of power effects or power structures of AI. I brought to you this classical or the question of how to define bias, and I told you that bias might be defined differently in psychology or cognitive science and in respect to AI, and referring to AI, we usually mean unjust impact on society. So on real people out there, unjust or harmful impacts of AI systems. So it's always about embedded AI systems. Yeah, it's hard, or it's comparatively boring, and only 10% of the story attributing a certain bias to the model, because many biases are pertaining to the system. If the distinction between a model, an AI model, and a system is that the model may be the, for instance, artificial neural network that is part of your system, but the system is how that is embedded in a certain reality, yeah, where it collects data, where it computes stuff and outputs data, where it has effects on the world, where it has impact and is embedded. The definition of biases in relation to computing systems has been around for a long time. And I think a good reference is Batya Friedman's and Helen Nissenbaum's paper on biases in computer systems, and they define the term bias to refer to computer systems that systematically and unfairly discriminate against certain individuals or groups of individuals in favor of others. And I told you that it is important that this is systematic, because if you accuse or if you attribute a bias to a system, if you say this system has a bias, that is always a statistical assertion. Like it is always a statistical claim, because you cannot observe a bias from only one instance, but you would have to kind of refer to a regularity that happens. So if many cases are judged, classified, whatever, treated by the system in a certain way, there can be a bias. And the other thing is this normative term unfair or unfairly, which they refer further down the chain of definitions to decisions or classifications or treatments that are unreasonable or inappropriate, whatever that means. So here you see that in the end, detecting and discussing biases about AI systems is always a matter that involves ethical and normative judgment. Yeah, there is no objective idea of these biases. It's always a question that is to be debated against a certain societal, political, ethical background, like of values, of norms, of judgments, and so on. I told you as well that detecting biases is not an easy task, because some of the biases that might happen in AI are biases that evade attention, and that's what also makes them so pervasive. And one of the structures through which biases can evade attention is intersectionality. So I reconstructed that concept of intersectionality going back, for instance, to the legal scholarship of Kimberly Crenshaw, who pointed out, with respect to certain court cases in the US in the 80s, that compound discrimination, so added or combined discrimination, for instance, along a racial and a sexual dimension, can go unnoticed in the legal system. That was her case, and the general message is that compound discriminations are not linear superpositions of the individual single dimension discriminations, but might actually multiply. So multiple axes of discrimination can be entangled, causing a bias that is more than the sum of the partial biases. And for instance, the harm done to black women is more than the harm done to women plus the harm done to black people. That was evident in some of the examples we discussed. I also, as an example, highlighted this very well-known and also impressive and therefore instructive example by Joy Bulamwini, who together with Timnit Gebru did in their study called Gender Shades, this analysis of gender classifiers, so facial recognition software that classifies gender from the face image putatively or allegedly. And what they found is that this works increasingly worse the darker the skin tone of the person on the image, and especially combined with, or especially for female people or female presenting faces, the classification accuracy was actually going to 50%, which is a coin toss, so which is no added value by the AI system, but it's just tossing the coin, the darker the skin gets. And I told you that there are maybe two, or at least two reasons for these biases in these systems, and probably it's actually a combination or maybe addition of both. The one reason is that black women were vastly underrepresented in the training data to these systems, or we don't know the training data because it's proprietary data, but what we know is that they are vastly underrepresented in the standard test or benchmark data sets that are usually or were usually being used to test those systems, so that there is a high probability that this bias would just evade your attention in the testing procedure or in the benchmarking procedures. And the other reason, of course, is the biases in the composition of research and development teams in the software industry, where black people or black women are heavily underrepresented, because had those teams had 2, 3, 4 black female presenting developers, maybe they would have noticed that their faces would have had a much worse of a likelihood to get detected well. I also alluded at this point at the importance of diversity, equity, and equality measures, especially in the tech industry, which are nowadays, given the Donald Trump regime, heavily under pressure. Yesterday it was on the news that SAP, the German software giant, discontinued their diversity, equity, and equality and inclusion programs. So the alt-right, ultra-conservative politics in the US even spreads internationally because they are pressurizing the companies that are heavily dependent on the American market, so that they would take up these social policies also outside of the legislative boundaries of the US state. The same goes, by the way, in research. The publicly funded, like research that has been publicly funded through US money, has already been discontinued if it is, for instance, research that happens at foreign universities, for instance, in Switzerland or in Germany, and if these universities in these research projects would employ certain diversity measures, they withdrew the money even in these cases. So this is a very harsh way of going against this diversity politics. I also brought this famous example to you of the COMPASS system. COMPASS is a recidivism scoring system used in the US to score the likelihood of criminal defendants to offend again. And this has been found to be heavily racially biased. And the interesting thing is, or what can be made visible here in this case, is that a bias can also occur on the level of error rates. That was already the story with the facial gender classifiers. Yeah, it's not the only example for this, but here it's so obvious that one of two dimensions of biases pertains to the risk of bearing or suffering from a wrong decision. And here For black defendant, it is much more likely to stay imprisoned as a result of an error. Yeah, this is why in the upper row, this number in the right column is so high, and in the second row, the number in the left column is so high, and that indicates that for white defendants, it's much more likely to get released as a result of an error, yeah? To get released but then reoffend again, so they shouldn't have been released at all. By the way, I do not at all agree that one should use predictive analytics in the sentencing or criminal justice system, predicting future behavior, and be it criminal behavior of individuals. I think this is morally wrong for even different reasons. So bringing this here as an example of bias is only is not to say that if the system didn't have these biases, then it is, in my view, ethically okay to use such systems in the criminal justice system. There are also good reasons why we don't, for instance, use such systems in European criminal justice systems, at least not to this extent. The message here is that many biases pertain to the error rate, yeah, and this is so important. This is maybe call it second order bias, maybe call it type B bias, whatever. The burden of misclassification, yeah, the risk that the system is just not well done, but not for everybody, but for certain marginalized communities, it's not well done, and the risk of suffering negative consequences, and be it a high risk of being wrongly classified, is unequally distributed in societies and usually affects marginalized and already vulnerable communities disproportionately. And this then leads to this, what I also termed self-fulfilling prophecy effect, or performative effect of AI, that AI systems can actually contribute to creating the inequalities or differences that they allegedly only describe, or described by way of predicting them. Yeah, if you deny credit and other resources from education to freedom to certain vulnerable populations by way of predictions, then of course life is harder, more expensive, and so on for these populations, and thereby you actually create that form of vulnerability and poverty, or at least increase it. And this is kind of the negative feedback loop that we can observe in many AI systems, while the public rhetorics often state that these systems are only descriptive towards reality. In these examples, you already see that we are in the midst of a discourse on power effects. This is not only ethics, yeah? The moment you do injustice at scale, sure, this is an ethical topic, but this is so much more, because it also reinstates power relationships of domination and subordination, relationships of manipulation, and so on, that in this case, or in the case of AI in general, we need concepts of power to debate ethical issues to the full extent that they impact society. And this is why I started this block on power and will now continue that block on power. And if you remember correctly from the second last session, so from session number 3, where I introduced the more early modern to modern conceptions of power, or a selection of them from Western philosophy, what we observed was this, that from Hobbes to Max Weber, all the theories of power that we encountered here shared one implicit assumption, and that assumption was that the existence of a more or less powerful individual as a starting point, and they did not explain how power might shape these individuals and their consciousness. Yeah, the idea was kind of an atomistic image of society. Yeah, there are first individuals, they are equipped with certain natural facilities, skills, capacities, powers. And if you take all them like together, something will happen. They might fight each other, like in the so-called state of nature, which is a fiction, or they might enter into social contracts where they mutually agree that they should not fight each other, but rather delegate certain for instance, punitive powers to a sovereign entity, and therefore would constitute something like the state in the sense of Thomas Hobbes and so on. But the idea here is that we start from the individuals. And as I told you, in the 100 years ago, when fascism was getting big in Europe, theoreticians were increasingly wondering, why do people actually join such a movement or such a politics? Why do they vote for such a politics that will in the end be disastrous, or especially against many people's own interests? So the observation, especially by many Marxist people, was Marxism predicted that there will at one point in the future be the revolution driven by the workers, so the working class will overthrow the ruling class in that kind of worker revolution that will then upend capitalism and undo capitalism and lead to the communist state. And now the worker movement engaged in the NSDAP and other fascist parties in Italy and Germany, and so actually kind of the opposite happened, because these fascist parties, they were allies with the big industry, and they were certainly not going against their interests, maybe a little bit at the front end at the level of rhetorics, but in the end this was kind of a revolution completely of a completely different kind than any Marxism would have envisioned. And then the question was, okay, why do people do that, or how can we make sense of this kind of a behavior of people who suddenly all join a kind of a similar movement that is so detrimental to the interests of the common good, and putatively only against their own interests. And if you classically envision the state and the individuals in this relationship, that individuals give right to sovereign power and sovereign power would rule over individuals in the sense of the theories that we encountered from Thomas Hobbes to Max Weber, then you will have a hard time explaining that. And this is why at this period approaches emerged, and approaches were of increasing interest that would kind of ask these questions. What if power shapes our desires, anxieties, perceptions, behavior, readiness to consent, rather than presuppose it? So we are here at a point where people started asking, maybe there are certain power effects that would shape individuals' consciousness in such a way that they endorse a certain politics, or that they are equipped with certain capacities and not with others, or that they are empowered only in a certain way but disempowered in many other ways. In short, maybe society shapes people and not only people shape society. And to make sense of that, we would need theories of power that have kind of a middle ground between big aggregate structures such as governments or large corporations and atomistic individuals on the other hand. And I already kind of pitched that for me this middle ground, or a concept that I find very useful to theorize this middle ground, is social structures. By social structures, I mean rough alignment effects. Yeah, effects where, for instance, our behavior, our wishes, our maybe also emotions, they would align roughly, not deterministically, and not without kind of variation in all directions, but roughly, on average, they would align in certain directions, and these I would call social structures. And the thing is that social structures are metastable states. Yeah, they are states that form a local equilibrium, like a locally stable state, so that small perturbations in any direction the system can resist against small perturbations in many directions. Yeah, sorry, I'm kind of falling into a very physicist vocabulary here, but being a physicist myself, I found that way of or that metaphor for structures quite useful. Maybe it's not the same for you, and you will find your own metaphors. This is only my kind of shorthand of visualizing in front of my eyes what I mean by social structures. Yeah, for instance, if you have this, imagine a big like plane, like here, with lots of little magnets that can rotate. Yeah, like magnetic sticks. They can rotate, magnetic arrows, if you will, and you have one like in a grid, and these magnets are the individuals. If it will not happen that all these magnets point in random directions because they mutually influence themselves. Yeah, what will rather happen is that they would align roughly in large tectonic areas, and then there might be another area where magnets align in a different direction because they also are a large group that has a certain critical mass. So you have these mutual alignment effects, while still each individual might slightly deviate or slightly have their own direction, which doesn't mean that there is no structural alignment. And this is why this escapes determinism from above and methodological individualism from below. Yeah, to do this a little bit more philosophically, it is now the time of the second session on power to turn to the theoretical legacy on such theories of power. And my choice here is these people. I think that you can already see very, very useful theorizing on these topics in Gramsci, which is this late Marxist Italian philosopher who wrote his philosophy in prison after he was imprisoned by the fascists. It was also a lot of contributions came from Louis Althusser, who is also a post-Marxist philosopher in France. I will mostly look here at Michel Foucault and Judith Butler, who articulated this in a even more like contemporary form. Especially the work of Judith Butler has been highly influential in the last 20 to 30 years. Their philosophy is maybe at the core of most of what I tell you here about the subject or the individual and power. But a lot of that goes back to Foucault, and today we will look at a lot of Foucault quotations actually, because in that writing, maybe this is one of the primary sources. Yeah, and all this goes under the title here of constitutive power. You can also say productive power. I use that synonymously. It is a power that constitutes or produces subjects or subjectivity. Maybe paradoxically, we will also come to that. And please bear with me. It is not the easiest lecture in this lecture series. I can already promise to you next week will be a very joyful and rather easy lecture. Today is a little bit more of a conceptual and theoretical lecture. I still try to make it as accessible as I can, also using examples, but please bear with me. I also have some background reading. I show it in the end, and it's also uploaded for the discussion groups, where this is explained in full detail and like in written form. If you rather prefer reading it than listening to it, that is also a solution. Yeah, so let's just dive into Foucault. Foucault, this French theoretician of post-structuralism, who died in 1984 from AIDS. Foucault was famous for his analyses of power knowledge apparatuses, and I will try to deliver a little bit of why or what is so special about his approach. The thing is that Foucault is more a philosopher who does analysis of power rather than theorize about power. So it is hard to find in Foucault or in his writings the one definition of power, because it is more that he develops a certain methodology of philosophically analyzing power apparatuses or power knowledge regimes, and in doing it, you can get a certain glimpse on how he understands power. Of course, there are also some more theoretical writings of him, and I will also refer to them, just for you just to tell you that there is not definition, Cullen, power is such a thing you will not find in Foucault. Foucault generally analyzes power as decentralized interplays of myriad elements. And this is why it is really something that is not so easy to define and more something that you have to demonstrate. And by the way, like what I've been doing in the first sessions here in the lecture and will continue doing in the next sessions is such an analysis in a way. But maybe that will become apparent to you only like looking at it as a whole, like maybe towards the end of the semester, I don't know. The thing is that analyzing power means you have to look at ensembles. And these ensembles, they can actually consist of kind of anything. He would refer to them as dispositifs. So the French term dispositif is often translated to English as apparatus. Nowadays, it is more often dispositif. Like in the beginning, this is a French term, but now the English people use it as well. But in the 70s, when it was first translated, they would translate it to apparatus, or machine, or ensemble. Quoting some Foucault, a dispositif is firstly a thoroughly heterogeneous ensemble consisting of discourses, institutions, architectural forms, regulatory decisions, laws, administrative measures, scientific statements, philosophical, moral, and philanthropic propositions. In short, the said as much as the unsaid. This is really kind of everything that can constitute a power apparatus. Yeah, so power is not with people, power is not with institutions alone. Power is kind of is something that happens in such constellations or ensembles, and would then be something that happens in the interplay of all these elements. Yeah, power is something that happens in the interplay of how, for instance, people enact with technology and with certain knowledge and with certain narratives and with certain ways of making sense of their own desires or their own wishes, or maybe how they perceive each other, and all this is in there. Power must then be understood as the multiplicity of force relations that are immanent in the sphere in which they operate and which constitute their own organization. I know this is a very hard sentence. I will kind of dissect that sentence on the next slide, but let's continue with the quotation first. As the support, so power must then be understood, and then comes the next bullet point in a way, must be understood as the support which these force relations find in each other. Remember the magnets aligning to each other and supporting each other in the way they are aligned. Yeah? No single individual likes heterosexual gender norms, but in a large formation where everybody goes by heterosexual gender norms, you have mutual support in this crappy norm, and that's how it is maintained. Yeah? That's maybe something that you can read in these lines. And lastly, as the strategies in which they take effect. Yeah? So power must be understood as the strategies in which these force relations take effect, whose general design or institutional crystallization is embodied in the state apparatus, in the formulation of the law, in the various social hegemonies. There is actually everything about power in Foucault in this very long enumeration style sentence, and in the next slide I will extract maybe the three basic pillars of that understanding of Foucault. So 3 points that are also worth remembering. The first point is this power is relational. Yeah, this is an understanding of power that seeks power in force relations. There are many like of these ensemble of heterogeneous things. Between these things there are force relations, and think of like vector fields if you are a physicist, and in the interplay there will emerge some effects. some like in the way different force relations between different elements in ensembles, they will lead to some overarching effect, and that is then power. So multiplicity of force relations immanent in the sphere in which they operate. I will comment on the term of immanence in a couple of slides later, so let's ignore that for the moment, because that makes it creepily complicated. It is maybe, if you want to understand this term relational, and if my talk about force relations and fields of force relations or vector fields is too evasive for you, you can also understand it by what it does not mean, or by what it opposes. And what this notion opposes is the idea that power is a possession of an individual. Yeah? It opposes directly the idea that you have power, you have slightly less power, and you have another kind of power. This is really not how it looks at the things. Nobody here has power. Power is only in our interactions or in our interplay, in the way we shape each other, or in the way kind of we interact also, like in this architecture where you sit in benches and I stand here, and where the light shines on me, and all this, yeah, is shaping my power in this situation. But my power in this situation would be an effect of you, all of you looking at me and kind of shutting up, the light shining on me, the kind of you having a watch that told you that it is 2 p.m., so time to get here. But also that this is a compulsory lecture in the program, because otherwise you wouldn't pay attention to me. Yeah, you see, it is really an ensemble that creates this very unusual constellation where 200 people would look at one person having a monologue for 2 hours. That's what I think is meant, yeah? And it really goes back to your interest in finishing your degree and my interest in earning money and whatever it is. Yeah, so this is why it is a heterogeneous ensemble. Yeah.
What about on the threat of violence? So when earlier on we also talked about power in the sense of being as one person's ability to get their way. One of the ways to get that way is through violence. Wouldn't when someone was giving a threat of violence, wouldn't there be far more? It would be far less relationship-wise and far more based on the one person's actions and will.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. It's good that it comes early on. So the question for the people online was, what if somebody is violent, or if somebody uses violence? Isn't that a very like unilateral way of exercising power that really comes from that person? So first, the answer has 2 parts. The one part is, I would say, such a theory of power is a theory of power for peace times. I mean, if we are all in war, like in the times when Thomas Hobbes was living with continental war in England and so on, maybe this is not your immediate scope on things. But the thing is that there is also power in the absence of immediate physical violence, and this is the kind of power that this theory gets into the focus. So exercise of violence would be kind of the corner case, the edge case in Foucault, which is a theory that is much better on power relations that do not get to the extreme point of using violence. Still, the use of violence is also in this theory as an extreme point, yeah, as an extreme, as moments of crystallization. I would say if I went to the 5th row and beat one of you, so I use violence, probably I wouldn't be so successful with that, because maybe you would kind of hinder me or overwhelm me, or I wouldn't actually even dare or wouldn't feel fit to confront the person. So a scene of me exercising physical violence has a certain foreplay, if you will, or a certain like path to it. And in that path already power relations happen. Yeah, for instance, if the police uses violence, that is an interesting scene. I would say that is kind of this extreme crystallization of a physical force that is enabled by so many factors, like political discourses that would prepare that it is now appropriate to beat protesters. The uniform the police is wearing, the training the police has, the certain, for instance, dehumanization of protesters, but also the way protesters might dehumanize the police and confront the police in a certain way that provides. So there are so many things that precede the actual use of the club, of the water cannon in acts of physical violence that are being brought into attention here with such more relational and productive theories of power that would rather ask the question, okay, how did that violence come about? Instead of, the actor had the power already with them, brought it in the scene, and then they exercised it. Yeah, this is, it's more the question, okay, what actually equipped this agent with that power to act physically, violently, in that very situation, or maybe also as a matter of their biography. So it doesn't only need to be a situation, but it can also be a larger context, and so on. The second point is this term of strategy that was in the quotation on the previous slide. It said that the power is strategic. And this is a very counterintuitive use of the term strategic, I would say. So it needs maybe some explanations. I would say the best shorthand to understanding what they mean, what Foucault means by strategic, is that force relations in social fields, they can mutually amplify each other. So they can stabilize each other, or they can also destabilize each other. For instance, if heterosexual marriage enables you to do Ehegattensplitting in the German tax law, and that leads to women, for women it's just ineffective to start working because they would pay so much additional taxes that they'd rather stay home. Then I would say there is a certain strategic alliance between certain gender roles and certain economic interests. And so there are things that mutually stabilize. And the thing about the notion of strategy here is that there is not somebody who plans this. Yeah, it is not the strategy of for instance, strategic individual that plans to have these different structures in place to enable patriarchy, for instance, but it is coincident amplifications, like it is contingent amplifications between certain configurations that altogether stabilize a certain constellation. And if you would then kind of try to change it, for instance, if you want to abolish Ehegattensplitting, that's hard because it is stabilized by so many other factors. And if you want to change one of these other factors, this is also so hard because it's stabilized by many factors. Among them, and among these is Ehegattensplitting. Yeah, you see, you have so multiple points where you would need to intervene to really change the system. And that is meant by strategic. Yeah, you can also envision this as an emergent organization. Yeah, many force relations might enter into relations of mutual stabilization that give rise to an emergent order, organization, structure. Here we are with the structure concept again. The third pillar is, and this is maybe also the title of this section here, that this power is productive. And productive means it produces or constitutes the way subjects reflect about their own motivations, impulses, needs, drives, desires. Yeah, the idea is that for instance, the vocabulary I use to make sense of myself or of you, maybe putting you in stereotypes because I don't know you so well, judging from your haircuts, judging whatever. This is not natural. This is not naturally given that that I associate certain, for instance, ways you appear with certain attributes. But this is rather a function of the social discourse in which we are all in. So there is a social discourse, like a regime of categories, norms, perceptions, things that I would perceive about, for instance, other people or myself. And this grid in which I kind of put people to make sense of social life is not universal or invariant, but it is very culturally situated. And that means two things. First, it is something that has been kind of emerging or kind of has taken shape. So it comes from somewhere and it has a history. Maybe it was different 50 years ago, and then certain power dynamics shaped it the way it is today. And the other thing, of course, is that it might also change further, so you can change it. Yeah, this is also actually a call to action. We can change the symbolic order, the social grid, the regime of identity categories that we use to make sense of people or of ourselves. Yeah, I mean, you can change it individually, and then you are kind of forming an island with yourself or with your close peers. This is not social change, this is individual change, but this is how maybe social change starts, changing it for yourself. But then the question is, how can we spread that? How can we really alter the social grid or the grid of norms so in a whole society? That is also connected to this perspective. Again here, this productive power, I have just tried to explain what it means kind of positively. If this doesn't speak to you, or if you want more clarity, it might also be a strategy to ask what is it opposed to conceptually, like what is the opposing concept. And the opposing concept of productive power or constitutive power is the idea that power is repressive. And this is actually something that Foucault has been working on very explicitly, because in these individualistic conceptions of power, you usually would have the story that goes like this, like nature equips the people with certain needs, drives, desires, facilities, power. And then comes society, and society would say, this would restrict you all the time. Yeah, it would say you must not steal, you must not kill, you must be heterosexual, you must this, you must that, and so on. And then these other theories of power would envision the relation between the individual and their innate powers and society as a repressive relationship. And Foucault, for good reasons that actually are going back to psychoanalysis, says no, it's the other way around. Especially social repressions, for instance, the repression of homosexuality, that was a big topic back 100 years ago. The repression of homosexuality actually creates homosexual desires. That is something that people would observe or like empirically theorize in psychoanalysis, and Foucault was taking it up. So the idea generally is no. What you desire is actually created by the social structures that try to always nudge you in certain directions, and that then has these, this is kind of the constitutive rereading that would go against any forms of essentialism. Yeah? And essentialism would be a strategy that says certain things that you want are innate, so they come from your biology or from your genes. And then comes society as a kind of a soft layer on top of that would repress certain of these things and put it in certain directions. And here the idea is exactly the other way around. that what you desire, what you feel, how you think, is more a reflection of the societal affordances or the societal structures that would multiply or duplicate in your consciousness, so that your consciousness is actually a mirror of society, rather than society being a consequence of some innate notion of desires or consequences. What do I want to say? Of something innate. Yeah. So the productive power idea is Foucault calls it against the repression hypothesis. Yeah. The repression hypothesis is something that has been guiding so much theorizing of power in sociology. And he would exactly position this approach against that. Yeah, and this leads us, I have already spent now 3, 4, 5 minutes on it. This leads us actually to the next topic, and this is the relation of power and subjectivity. By subjectivity, roughly, we mean how people refer to themselves, to other, and to the world. Yeah, the concepts, the perceptions, the terms by which people make sense of things. Let's call that subjectivity. There will be a definition later that is slightly more precise, but like for the moment, that's a good approach. And you can already see that the relation between power and subjectivity is maybe the intricate field in this form of theorization. Let's go with a quote that makes that explicit. Foucault says that power applies itself to the immediate everyday life, which categorizes the individual, marks them by their own individuality, attaches them to their own identity, imposes a law of truth on them, which they must recognize and which others have to recognize in them. It is a form of power which makes individuals subjects. Yeah, individuals versus subjects, you see that? There are two meanings of the word subject, and this is really very central now to this whole form of theorization, and this comes from the French, where these two meanings are also in the same word. There are two meanings to the word subject. The one, subject to someone else by control and dependence, and tied to their own identity by a conscience or self-knowledge. Yeah, so the idea here is that for instance, if you are being labeled, I don't know, with all the labels that we are confronted with every day, the idea, for instance, that you perceive yourself as a student, let's go with this very unspectacular example, that you are a student, it's not a naturally given identity label, right? But it's something that comes from our society, which has this notion of a student, but it becomes part of your identity. Maybe it does, maybe it does not, maybe it does more, or maybe it does less. Yeah, there is room for this. There is room for this more or less. Yeah, but the idea is that being attributed with certain labels, and of course, gender would be a prime example to make that explicit. But also, you are a high-risk customer, you are a security risk, you are someone that deserves a bank account, you are not. You will be searched by the police, you will be passing the police without being searched. And all this are encounters between some societal institutions and yourself that would, and this is what Foucault says, attach a certain identity to yourself. So, and by attaching, we mean two things at the same time. On the one hand, you are attributed these properties, these attributes, student, female, migration background, and so on. But, and this is now the thing, you start using that on yourself as something that shapes your consciousness of yourself. Yeah, you start relying on these attributions that come from outside to make sense of yourself in relation to others, to compare yourself to others, to narrate you. I mean, look at little 3-year-old kids that identify very well as boy or girl, and so on. And this is kind of the double structure of subjectivity, that on the one hand, norms, identity categories, and so on come from without, from the societal structures that place you at your position in a certain order. But subjects maintain that order by applying these categories on themselves and on their peers. Yeah, I also use the categories to make sense of you. You see the double structure, yeah? And this is such a clever way, clever in question marks, of course. This is such an intricate way of not being repressive towards the individuals, but of kind of harnessing the individuals to perpetuate or enact the interests of the apparatus. Yeah, if I make you identify by heterosexual gender norms, then that means that you apply them to yourself, so you take care of your own behavior. I don't need to kind of repress you or to sanction you. The apparatus, I mean. But the apparatus is done in such a way that it can influence or like it can maintain certain behavioral norms, for instance, without being violent or repressive, at least not in the midst, like in the center of society, only at the margins, yeah? The real physical force of, for instance, heterosexual gender norms are felt only by marginalized people, but not by the average, although the average is fully in the apparatus of reiterating them every day on themselves and on others. And this is very relevant in the context of AI. When you remember the first session, when I tried to tell you that all of AI that we have nowadays relies on the fact that millions and billions of users worldwide voluntarily produce data and participate as cognitive subunits in AI apparatuses without being forced, but coming from their inner motivations. But these inner motivations are not innate, they are produced. Or at least the theory I'm presenting you invites you to question this behavior as a behavior that is produced by a certain power apparatus, which has an interest in you performing these behaviors because it serves the apparatus. Yeah, so this is a methodology of deconstructing the participation of all of us in larger power apparatuses. And as AI capitalism uses this more soft, non-physical power especially in the center of Western societies, while the more physical power, where people really suffer physically, will be visibly only in the margins of our societies, or, for instance, in countries where more click workers are, or where people are exploited in new forms of labor. Yeah, but for the majority, or for the hegemonic discourse, as you would say, this form of power manages to get along without violence, or at least without physical violence, by kind of implanting its imperatives, its interests in our own way of referring to ourselves, so in our self-consciousness. Yeah, so the relationship between the subject and power apparatuses has two directions in this form of theorization. The one is that subjectivity is shaped by dispositives of power. They enable or they encourage certain behaviors, certain concepts to make sense of yourself, to reflect on yourself, to call your friends and so on, and they discourage certain others. And the other direction is, that was what I just said, and the other direction is the subjects altogether collectively enact the power apparatuses. Think of the Leviathan with all the little people in the body. Yeah, it was already there, but the people in the body of the Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, they were in the body as a matter of obedience. That was highly repressive. Yeah, that was kind of military discipline. You had to obey by the sanction of penalty. I don't have to obey to Google by the sanction of penalty. I cannot use Google, or I can try to cheat Google. They will not care. Yeah, it is. This here is now soft power, and it goes in both directions. This is important. Yeah, so subjects, when we use the term subject instead of individual, we want to additionally say it is an individual with the additional kind of claim or proposition that the individual behaves in such a way that it perpetuates a certain power apparatus. And at the same time, their perpetuating the power apparatus is something that they don't do voluntarily or as a matter of like a voluntary decision or volitional decision, but this is how they grew up in our society. Yeah, I never made the decision to perform a certain gender role. Maybe I did, but later on in the life. Yeah, but you first get thrown in it, and you grow up or get socialized performing certain behaviors, and these behaviors are already within a certain dispositif of power, and therefore add to the perpetuation of certain social structures. There's another quotation. Do we need it? Yeah, let's go for it. This is maybe now a subtlety, but let's go through it. Bear with me. Sometimes I say subject, and sometimes I say subjectivity. And you can make that distinction clearer if you are interested in this detail. Otherwise, you can just sleep for 30 seconds. So subjectivity refers to the way in which the subject experiences itself in a game of truth, where it relates to itself. My vocabulary, which is again more physical, is subjects are the carriers of subjectivity, yeah, or the agents of a subjectivity. I am the agent of a subjectivity. That means I perceive the world in or making use of the epistemic resources that I got from the world. So I use the terminology that is out there in our society, the perceptions, the feelings, the values to make sense of myself, of the world. And this is then my exercising a certain subjectivity. This subjectivity is certainly highly historically situated. Yeah, had I lived 100 years ago, or would I live in 100 years, my subjectivity would be different. My subjectivity would also be different. Would I be living in Indonesia? My subjectivity would also be different, or can also change, for instance, through processes of reflecting on myself, working on myself, trying to deconstruct all the things I take for natural or for granted, and questioning them as kind of power invested behaviors or perceptions. That is also something where you can individually change or alter or play with your subjectivity. So to study subjectivity means to study the constitution of the subject as an object for itself. Yeah? I reflect about myself. And not only, this is my hand and this is my arm, but more like, why actually do I use this norm to refer to myself, or this, why do I call me this? Is it important to me? Why is it important to me? How did that come about? Is it necessary? Do I do any harm to myself or to others by using that? Maybe I shouldn't do it. But it's not so easy not doing it. Damn, what can I do? This kind of reflection is what we mean here. So the formation of procedures by which the subject is led to observe itself, analyze itself, interpret itself, recognize itself as a domain of possible knowledge. Yeah, I don't need to have possible knowledge. Yeah, if I have a stomach ache, I can just have a stomach ache, but I can also try to Google around, what can it mean? What parts are there in my stomach, and why does it this? And then I have a full theory, I have full knowledge of it, and then I have a completely different self-relation, just to make a stupid example. And 30 years ago, I would not have had the opportunity to Google for that knowledge, but I would have to go to the library or to ask my doctor, and then I'm dependent of my doctor, and the doctor would have full control over my knowledge of my body. Nowadays, I can acquire that knowledge through different channels, and so the subjectivity changes, or the way this knowledge is entangled with power. You see, knowledge and power are closely related in Foucault, because knowledge is what kind of steers or shapes the way people reflect about themselves and about others. 30 seconds are over. I have this wrap-up slide here. I was thinking, let's get this relief for 1 second with a little wrap-up, and then we continue. But this triple of concepts, subjectivity, power apparatuses, and the subject, this is important. The way of referring to yourself, to others, and the world in the context of an ensemble of discourses, norms, practices, institutions, and so on, this is what we call subjectivity. And if it is exercised by a certain agent, then you would call that agent a subject. And being a subject means two things at the same time, being subordinate to that societal grid, and at the same time contributing to the societal grid or to the societal regime by perpetuating its norms. The norms are not there beyond the aggregate behavior of people. There is no entity here in the room that is called the norm beyond our collective enacting the norms, but also our collective enacting the norm would shape your behaviors, and this is why it is a bidirectional relationship and not only a methodological individualism explaining the norms from bottom up and nothing else. Exercising subjectivity through reflexivity or actions contributes to the power apparatus. I told you that. And the material or personal manifestation of a carrier or agent of subjectivity is called the subject. I told you that as well. We can skip the next slide to get to the point. Why is this relevant in the context of AI ethics? And I told you already, going back to the first lecture where I kind of invited you to look at AI apparatuses as distributed, large-scale distributed computing systems or computing networks by means of this notion of human-aided AI. There we had it that most of AI today relies on the extraction of data and maybe cognitive abilities or cognitive skills from millions of users. So the arrows would point only in the right direction, that all users contribute something to AI apparatuses. The thing is, that's not enough, because these apparatuses are not by nature so attractive that millions of people would contribute their cognitive skills and data to these apparatuses. It needs something in the backward direction that makes users available or be available to contribute their time and energy and data and so on to the apparatuses. And this is exactly the backward direction. AI, and by that here I mean AI capitalism, the media culture of AI. AI shapes subjectivities. AI has an impact on how we perceive ourselves, how we relate to knowledge, how we access knowledge, how we access resources, and so on. And one of the most immediate examples we had in the bias section, for instance, this is how AI would contribute to maintaining certain hierarchical social organizations or social structures or social orders. Here by perpetuating stereotypes or by excluding some people or by criminalizing some people. These are the more extreme forms of power effects. But then there are these more, let's say, softer power effects that are more mainstream or more hegemonic. For instance, here, ChatGPT widgets. We do a lot of work at schools, like going to school classes, and one consistent observation that we had is that so many people at school, they use ChatGPT all the time in school for the school lessons and like to answer the tasks or exercises from the teacher. And ChatGPT would already be at the lock screen of my mobile phones. So there seems to be really a shortcut, a wormhole from people getting a certain question or a certain task to them, to their thumb already starting the ChatGPT widget and typing the question in it, or using voice recognition so that it doesn't even need to be typed. So that seems to be so intimately tied or knitted into subjectivity today. So the way we access knowledge, maybe this applies to you as well, I don't know, that this is certainly a subjectivity shaping aspect of AI technology nowadays. But also, and much older and much more boring possibly, of course, the whole curation of content online is how AI would shape our perceptions of the world, of opportunities, of political choices, when it's about political voting behavior and so on. And here even misinformation is a subjectivity shaping effect of AI, if you will. Yeah, the discourses, the societal discourses in which we make sense of the world, especially politically, but also, for instance, in terms of gender and so on. Think of the manosphere, think of all these anonymous spheres in the web that give you advice on almost everything out there, and much of this is fake information or misinformation or highly distorted information. That is certainly of highly subjectivity shaping import. And then there is the other direction. Yeah, this is how we get something from AI, or how AI shapes subjectivity, but then AI also depends on specific subjectivities, which means AI needs to constitute or to shape the subjects in such a way that they are available to provide their data and their cognitive skills. And this is here. Do you remember that image? I don't know, from the first session where I told you that there is this, and Andrew Ng does it in his lecture at the Stanford Business School. He says when you want to build an AI system or a commercially viable AI business idea, you would have to drive this virtuous circle of AI where you have to create a product that attracts users, because only if you have users, they produce data, and that improves the product, and you have to kind of drive that feedback loop that amplifies your business. So you need something like an interface, an app, whatever it is, that makes people want to use it, or that makes people provide their data voluntarily. And this means you will have to come up with ideas of how to shape their needs, desires, motivations in a way that they return to your product. And this technology actually has been developed over 15 or 20 years now, and the next session will be a full session on that. How do we make people stick to these digital services? Because we need them, and I'm saying all this in question marks, otherwise we cannot do AI. So, I mean, we had these many things of voluntary data production on the web in one of the sessions. I think it was in the first session, and I also tried to differentiate between different strategies such as gamification, trapping, and harnessing social motivations, and you see all that here on the image. And then there is also the more explicit and potentially exploitative forms of harnessing individuals for data, which are, for instance, in the gig economy or click work and so on. So think or remember this second thesis of human-aided AI, the correspondence principle. Machine learning problems are translated into the design of human-machine interaction. And we had that in the first session. And then there was this little sentence underneath saying the design is optimized to make or keep users available as training data producers, which is free and often unrecognized labor. And the thing is, you don't only design a nice product, but if you want to analyze that on a slightly broader perspective, you would have to say that we established, or the tech industry established, a media culture. Expectations towards interaction design, towards graphical user design, that as a whole is a certain way of keeping users available as data generators. So it's not the single app alone that has strategies of how to hook their users, but I mean, the next scale would be, for instance, ecosystems such as Apple with their design choices, which are different from Android interaction design, so that people are stuck with one of them and not easily switch between them. But then, if you zoom out even more, you would find that we are all in a huge lock-in effect of using smartphones at all. Yeah, it's not easy to undo with your smartphone or to just leave it at home. And yeah, I want to highlight that this is part of the power strategy in AI, which is an ensemble, once again. Yeah? It does not have the single powerful player, but it is an ensemble of multiple players with slightly different interests, but that work well along each other, also with some fightings and some disruptions. No, this is also part of the game, but as a whole, they form an ensemble that forms a certain dispositive of power that shapes subjectivity, so subjective behavior in such a way that we always return to these services or to the devices and so on. AI produces subjects that voluntarily share their data, and this is the direct reading or application of this idea of productive power, because as much as commercial AI systems rely on human labor, yeah, they need it. Their development and deployment is also about hacking our subjectivity, so hooking it in a way that is not repressive. Yeah, this is the art, doing it in a non-repressive way, not forcing you to return to the app, but making you want to return to the app in order to make users want to use those services. So we are not only observing the extrication or extraction of resources and labor in the AI industry, yeah, as you can read in Kate Crawford and so on, but what we also see is that the power of AI reproduces users as voluntary labor force. Yeah, and this is more. It's not only extrication. Extrication is unilateral. Yeah, I always extricate. I extricate from the rare metals, rare earths. I extricate energy. I extract like labor from populations. What this perspective adds is, no, there is also like something that happens in the other direction. And what happens in the other direction is that the power of AI capitalism has its mechanism to reproduce its own labor force. And by labor force, I mean also the users. Yeah, the reproduction of the means of production would be the Marxist terminology for that. Yeah, the Marxists already knew that capitalism does not always only extract, but it also kind of has mechanisms to take care that there will be a workforce available tomorrow once again. Yeah, because who wouldn't run away from extraction? The thing is, we have to shape the thing in such a way that we cannot run away from the extraction. Otherwise, there wouldn't be extraction, because extraction is not fun. Yeah, so we need to reproduce users as subjects. We also need to reproduce click workers and gig workers and Deliveroo drivers and Uber drivers and so the full range. Yeah, that brings me to the last part. That is a very bleak picture, some people say, or some people sometimes react. Especially, there is one major objection that often comes, and with good right. The objection is that aren't we kind of in a very deterministic picture here? Yeah, if our thoughts, perceptions, desires are shaped by power, by the societal power apparatus, how can we ever resist? Yeah, isn't our behavior fully determined or fully programmed? Aren't we kind of marionetten in this game of power? Some critiques against Foucault called it docile bodies. Yeah, Foucault is allegedly kind of drawing the picture of docile bodies that are only kind of following external orders or programming by power. The thing is, I would say that this is a misunderstanding systematically, but I will not make the systematic point here today. I will just show you why this is not productive to see that way in the case of AI, or in the case generally. And what Foucault and Butler, or how they react, or how they escape this problem of determinism, of alleged determinism, is through the concept of critique. And maybe this is, I don't know, but like if you want to do ethics and power, if you want to bring together ethics and power, maybe the notion of critique is the elephant in the room. Maybe then we also should have a notion of critique. Critique is a long-standing philosophical concept. I don't mean criticizing you for something, but I mean really the deeper notion of critique, as in Immanuel Kant, Kritik der reinen Vernunft, or and so it goes. And Foucault and Butler, with this specific outlook on social philosophy, they also have a very specific conception of critique. And this conception of critique, I need to sketch it here very briefly to tell you why this is not the deterministic picture, and to tell you where is actually the agency of the subjects. Yeah, this is the big question. Like, if power determines our wishes, our thoughts, and everything, how do I have my own agency? Yeah, you have your own agency, but through critique. So the idea of critique is to fluidify the knowledge practices norms that we take as natural and universally given. The idea is that if you tell subjects that, for instance, what they would reflect as their genetically determined behavior or natural wishes or biologically determined orientation in the world, if you tell them that this is actually a way of reflecting about yourself that is invested with certain power interests, so with certain interests of certain entities in society and so on, this form of narratives can then unleash the insight in individuals to kind of resist, to think, so this is not natural, this is actually the product of certain interests. For instance, how many discussions did we have that it is just the easiest thing to use Dropbox to share my data with you. It's just natural. But if I tell you that how Dropbox took 10 years, the company Dropbox took 10 years of engineering their own popularity, their own inevitability or perceived inevitability in using it to send data from A to B, maybe we should better do it with WeTransfer, because so many people use WeTransfer now to transfer big images or big files. But this is really not without alternatives. And if you tell people how certain products, for instance, tried to position themselves in the perception of people or on the market as the one inevitable product to reach a certain goal, as a strategy of power, as a strategy, for instance, for market domination, then you can, this is the idea in Foucault and Butler, then you can unleash some more resistant forces. Like, then you can fluidify the perceived reification, the idea that this service is a naturally given thing instead of my choice. So you can counter reification by telling the genesis of the things as power histories. That is the idea behind critique here, by showing how they are a product of power relations and have a power-driven history of becoming. I know that this is complicated. I don't expect you to get these notions of critique here from my 2 slides. But I still need to include it in this lecture here. First, because some of you are interested, and second, because that is kind of the missing puzzle piece in the whole picture. So the idea is that you cannot necessarily determine your own behavior completely arbitrarily. I mean, try to not behave how it is expected to you. This is actually a tough job, to come up with a completely random behavior. I mean, even if I try to resist your expectations towards me now, I might just turn around or hide behind the desk, but that would still be a behavior that is shaped by opposing the expectations. So the expectations are still in there. So what would be a completely random behavior? There is maybe no such thing, and this is the idea. But there is my capacity to reflect on, for instance, the constellation of expectations, or the constellation that shaped how I am to behave in a certain situation, and then discover that this is not something natural, and then I can maybe shift it slightly. And Judith Butler built their whole philosophy on this idea of we cannot diametrically oppose certain social norms, but we can slightly shift them. Yeah, we can shift them in an irritating way, or we can subvert them in a way that still refers to the norm, but also is a little bit, how would you say that? Not within the norm, but slightly outside of the norm. Yeah, for instance, Judith Butler's big breakthrough was with this book called Gender Trouble, where they did this with this idea of drag, drag performance in gender. So that comes from the gender discourse. But the notion of critique in Foucault is much bigger than gender irritation, but this is maybe still a good example to make clear what Butler means. So the idea of critique in this theoretical tradition, or in this tradition of social philosophy, is that critique is not primarily I criticize you, or I criticize politics, or I criticize the AI industry. This is only the second step. The first step is I criticize myself. Because in order to even be able to understand how certain power structures work, I need to understand how they shape my own consciousness. I basically have to fluidify or deconstruct the entanglement between my own self-knowledge and power interests in order to be able to really call out the power interests. That is the idea. This is why critique in this approach starts with work on yourself, questioning your perceptions, question what you take for granted, what you naturalize, what you essentialize, and so on. Real change requires a change of mindset or habits. There is also little calling for instance, overthrowing Google. Yeah, this is also a good example. There are many people who say we should, for instance, disempower or destroy big power accumulations in the industry, which I certainly think one should. But without transforming user behavior at the same time, or maybe even as a prerequisite, I'm not sure this works, because then there would be the next power accumulation with a new company, because the mindset doesn't change. Yeah, so I would say large structural transformations go hand in hand with more individual transformations, and that is something that this social philosophy brings to light. And also something that I want to focus on slightly here in this approach to the ethics of AI, because we enable AI in our behavior, all of us, and also the exclusive and the harmful effects of AI are enabled by our behavior. So we cannot deny that there is also something that we need to do ourselves, with ourselves, like working on ourselves and our behaviors and our usage habits, while at the same time, only doing this is not enough. Yeah. If I tell you, don't use Google anymore, uninstall Facebook or Instagram and TikTok, then you would have changed your behavior, but that would not save the world either. Apparently we need to operate on multiple layers at the same time. And this is where we get here in the next and final set of slides. The power-aware ethics of AI must operate at 3 scales at the same time. And this is because the power of AI operates at 3 scales at the same time. And the scales on which the power of AI or AI capitalism operates is first, of course, aggregation. Yeah, we are dealing with highly powerful quasi-sovereign entities in the form of large corporations. There is economic power that accumulates wherever data accumulates. It's a rough shorthand. But then there is also the layer of social structures, which is not the same kind of scale. It's more a mesoscale, like a scale of one society, or maybe even peer groups or milieus. And on this scale, AI systems shape, for instance, who is visible, who has access to resources, who gets discriminated, how do we communicate, yeah, through which technology, with which kind of norms and habits, how do we access knowledge, how do we distribute knowledge or spread knowledge. This is all, I mean, this is not determined by the companies. Yeah? It's not determined from the aggregate poll, but it is an emergent form of organization in the ensemble of technology that we have, which forms this kind of social structures. Yeah? They are there because it aligns between us. If it was only me, it wouldn't be a problem, but it aligns between us. And then there is the third level of subjectivation, or of the individual. So the design of products, of interfaces and digital spaces produces subjects that are available to contribute to networked AI systems. Yeah, this is the level of ourselves. And we are in charge of asking, okay, how much am I kind of educated by using Apple devices for the last 20 years, of being a part of the Apple army of users that generate data every day for Apple, for instance, or for Google, and so on. Yeah, this is the individual layer. And if you want to kind of change or do meaningful societal politics or transformation, or even only kind of responsible co-creation of AI, you would have to operate on all these three layers simultaneously. This is why at the aggregate layer, we can question, okay, what are the values, principles, approaches that we adopt when we regulate the industry? Yeah, that can go by, for instance, deontological approaches, as I told you in the second session. At the level of structuration, the work that we have to do is actually making it visible, yeah? Naming, judging, and preventing the structural effects of AI. Yeah, because, for instance, through intersectionality, many of these effects would evade our consciousness, or we are not aware of how click workers feel or suffer in certain countries, for instance, in the global south. We are probably not even aware of how it feels to be a Deliveroo driver or Uber Eats driver in Osnabrück. I don't know. Although some, sorry, didn't want to offend, because some here engage actually with them in the labor union. I know that, but this is actually a work that we need to do to be aware of how that perspective looks like. And on the level of subjectivity, the ethical approach, or the job of ethics of AI would be to invite people to self-critique, to kind of understand how their behavior is feeding certain power interests, and maybe how can we resist, in the sense of not doing something, but doing maybe slightly differently, or in a way that is more kind of queering the interests of the power apparatus. And like, this is the three-scale architecture of power-aware ethics of AI, and you allow for 1 minute more, then we are through. In terms of time, power-aware ethics of AI also has like 3 steps that I would say need to come in succession. So a power-aware AI ethics must proceed in 3 steps, not operate only on 3 scales, but also in 3 steps in terms of time. And these are also the 3 steps I take here in the lecture. And the first step is we need to reflect on how does the power of AI work. Yeah? So far here in the lecture, we are only descriptive. I only try to come up with maybe slightly shifted descriptions of the AI capitalism as a huge dispositif of media culture and power. And this is by purpose, because I first want to kind of make clear, or kind of provide an affordance, like a conceptual affordance of how to make sense, or how to understand, or how to make visible AI as a power thing. The next step would be self-critique. Yeah? Once you are aware of the entanglements with power, you can start asking, okay, and what's my role in this? Like, did I fall prey to some of these kind of naturalizations, reifications that are suggested to me in the mainstream discourse? And how does that actually change my consciousness, my behavior, my goals? my motivations. And then I would say one is ready to ask normative questions, and this is the third step, yeah, being normative, judging about the state of affairs. But if you judge, if you do the third step at the first step, which actually most of ethics of AI out there does, you fall prey to the problem that you did not kind of deconstruct your own consciousness about what is natural, and then you would come up with certain norms that inherit the reifications and objectifications that are only a product of the power apparatus, and then you will not actually go for transformation, but only for the same in a different guise or disguise or something. I can explain you in the beginning of next session, because I know that this might have been slightly elliptic now. But still, thanks for listening. I was asked to announce the readings early on. So here I am. I tried to upload the readings in the week before and announce them here in the lecture. So for this week, I recommend these readings. It will also be in the discussion groups. And thank you very much, and see you next week.